full mom duty tonight, so if we're not done by 5:30, Councilmember Scott's going to take over because I got kids to pick up. But with that, we're going to start with our mid-year budget review, and our finance director, Anthony Francisco, is going to take it away. I will ask that we hold the questions till the end because there tends to be a "that's answered on the next page" phenomena happening with this. So.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of the council. As the mayor said, I'm Anthony Francisco, the Chief Financial Officer or Finance Director.
Oh, wait. Sorry.
And if we need more copies, we have them. This is our mid-year budget review for the fiscal year 2019-2020, the fiscal year ending June 30th of 2020. And we have been having this mid-year budget review for about 12 years now. It is mandated in our city reserve policies that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. Basically, the mid-year budget review is started by the audit process, and when council has adopted the audit for the previous fiscal year in December, and we have those numbers plugged into everything as they relate to the carryovers into the current fiscal year, council wanted to have a look at where we were at the close of the audit. So that's where we are in the budget process right now. So the first page that you have there is our general fund summary as it shows at the end of the audit process. And I am just concentrating on the general fund this evening. So we have similar fund summaries for every fund of the city, but because the general fund is where it's the largest fund of the city, it's where the mandated action is, and it's where the big problems are, we're concentrating on that this afternoon. As you see there in column A, we ended fiscal year 2018-2019 with a general fund balance of $8,281,000. And that figure carries forward to the top of column C. So comparing the beginning fund balance for the close of the audit fiscal 19 to the beginning of fiscal year 20, you see that we started this fiscal year with the fund balance of about $2 million more than we thought we would when the budget was adopted. And that's a great thing. But as you know, and that's pretty much the figure that I've been reporting to council since we turned the figures over to the auditors back in September. So you've seen that number before. We made a decision to spend down a lot of that fund balance during this fiscal year, and this is shown on line 51. When the general fund upfronted the money to the public transit fund for the city's taking over of the public transit operations. We upfronted about $5 million to get that fund started. We expect to get some of that money back, but that shows up right now in our general fund summary, such that we're now projecting at the end of this fiscal year, if all of our projections hold true, we will draw down about $5.8 million of that fund balance this fiscal year and close this fiscal year on line 65 and 71 with an ending fund balance of $2.465 million. That $2.465 million fund balance would be about $56,000 short of our mandated 3% operating reserve in the general fund, and that is on line 69. So that's a problem, but that is a manageable problem. We could certainly make up that $56,000 and we'd be okay. On the next page, and this is what we usually do at the mid-year budget review. On the next page, we have updated our revenue projections for the general fund based on how our revenues have actually been coming in this fiscal year and updated those revenue projections based on our performance so far to date. So you see there on line 4, our sales tax revenues have been coming in pretty much right on budget, and we've been reporting that to the Finance Committee monthly. Our use tax revenues are quite a bit above budget, so we think that we will bring in about $1 million more than what we budgeted for in use tax. But our franchise fee revenues are well below budget, and that's primarily because of our cable revenues are way down, our OG&E franchise fee revenues are way down because it was such a mild summer. So we think we're going to be about $900,000 short on our franchise fee revenue. And our license and permit revenues are down fairly substantially because of the slowdown in the building industry.
Mr. Francisco, do you have an extra copy for Councilmember or Wilson? Sorry.
The late person.
Thank you. Sorry, I had it more on the second.
All of those things taken together then on line 16, you see that we would be projecting our revenues to be really close, right on budget for this fiscal year, all of those things taken together, about $400,000 short of our budgeted levels. As you know, I always try to budget conservatively, and I hope that where we err on the side that revenues come in above budget. So that's a bit of a problem, but again, a manageable problem. We'd have about $400,000 to make up on the revenue side, and we'd be okay because, again, on line 51, we expect that number on the expenditure side to be less. We expect to get $2 million in from the federal government, from the Federal Transit Authority, to make up some of that expenditure that the general fund has upfronted. So again, on line 65 and line 71, we project that we would close this fiscal year with a fund balance of $2,088,000, which we now project on line 69 would be about $433 short of our ordinance mandated 3% operational reserve. And again, most years we've been projecting that we'd be above our 3% operating reserve in the general fund. So we have problems already. But at this position, at this point in time, those problems would be manageable. I would be suggesting to council things that we might be doing, things that we might be suggesting, savings areas and that sort of thing to make up that $433,000, and we'd be okay. But on the next page, we have updated those projections for the problem that has been foisted upon us. As you know, our sales tax revenue projections on line 4 were based on the council action when you adopted the budget of our ending the apportionment of sales tax to the North Park TIF Fund as of July 1st. And council followed through on that action when you approved the ordinance that changed the project plan in November for the agreed to changes to the project plan that were agreed to by the developer. And by the adoption of that ordinance, we would have been able to stop apportioning sales tax to the TIF fund as of July 5th, July 1st. Unfortunately, that ordinance that council adopted has been challenged by a petition and has been held in abeyance. And the city attorney is here. She may speak to the timing of that, but basically, we won't know anything that will, whether we can implement that council action, that ordinance, for several months from now. And so that creates an unmanageable problem for us. That means that we have the discussed and feared $3.5 million hole in our budget this fiscal year. And that's reflected in the difference in the sales tax projections between column B and column C. Dropping down to line 51, we've now built in that $2 million that we expect to come in from the Federal Transit Administration. But all of those things taken together on line 63 we now project that we will have to draw down $7.5 million of our general fund balance this fiscal year. And by all of those actions, we will close this fiscal year with a general fund balance on line 65 and 71 of only $760,000. And on an $83 million budget, that is an unacceptably low fund balance. That's less than 1%. As you see on line 69, if all of those actions come to pass, we would close this fiscal year $1.7 million short of our legally mandated by ordinance 3% operating reserve by $1.7 million. I've been the finance director for the city of Norman for 23 years. I've been doing mid-year reviews for 12 years, and I have never had to present a picture this bleak for our general fund. And as you see, carrying forward to column D, this problem is projected to carry forward into our sales tax revenues next year. It has concerned me when council and members of the public have cavalierly stated, just let the TIF run its course. Understand that that has a devastating impact on our general fund. All of our projections have been based on the ending of the apportionment of sales tax as quickly as we can by that agreement to end that apportionment July 1st. But if we let the TIF run its course, if the action that the council took in November is not implemented, not only do we have an additional $3.5 million hit to our general fund this year, but we have $1.5 million hit to our sales tax revenues in the general fund next year. That's pictured in the difference in column D between this page and the previous page. We went from $46,600,000 to $45 million in projected sales tax next fiscal year. And as you see in column D, if all of those projections hold true, at the end of next fiscal year, the fiscal year that we are in the process of producing the budget right now, the budget that council will adopt in June, we would close that fiscal year with an ending fund balance of $3.3 million negative. By state law, the council cannot adopt a budget with a negative fund balance in any fund. By our council mandated ordinance operating reserve on line 69 in column D, we would be $5.8 million short of our policy and ordinance mandated operating reserve in the general fund. These are unmanageable problems that have been foisted upon us because council's action has not been implemented.
Can we wait till the end?
Oh, yeah, I can wait till then.
Going on to the next pages. Again, I've heard discussion from members of council and members of the public of just take it out of the rainy day fund. The mayor asked me to go through what the rainy day fund policies actually say. This is straight out of the city code of the city of Norman. I've highlighted a couple of sections here. The city's general fund shall have an unappropriated operating reserve fund balance of at least 3% of annually budgeted expenditures in addition to an appropriated emergency reserve account of 1% of annually budgeted expenditures. Okay, so that's the 3% reserve that we've been talking about. That's mandated by this ordinance. The city shall also have, and there is hereby established, a net revenue stabilization fund to also be referred to as the rainy day fund, and skipping over to the next page, which will have not less than 4% but not more than 7% of annually budgeted general fund expenditures in the then current fiscal year. So again, if you add up all of these mandated reserves, we mandate a 3% operating reserve by this ordinance. We mandate that there has to be at least a 1% emergency reserve budgeted line item allocation in the general fund, and we have to have at least a 4% reserve in the rainy day fund. All of that taken together is an 8% reserve mandate. And that's a prudent mandate. That's not way too much. The Government Finance Officers Association recommends that governments have a 10% reserve in their general fund. So our reserve policies have been copied by a lot of cities throughout the state, certainly been adopted whenever we have done the audit. And when we come to this mandated mid-year budget review, we have usually been talking about, are we going to make a deposit to the rainy day fund to keep it at its targeted level? We've never been at this point in the process talking about drawing down the rainy day fund balance, and we've certainly never been talking about drawing down the rainy day fund balance when we don't have a federally declared disaster or anything that has happened to us. So look at the strings attached to the rainy day fund in the next highlighted section. Only the council can appropriate fund balance. So within the rainy day fund, it's a council action to appropriate fund balance in the rainy day fund. The net revenue fund balance can only be appropriated in instances in which, 1, unexpected expenses are incurred within the City of Norman General Fund due to natural or man-made disasters as declared by the President of the United States or the Governor of Oklahoma and by the Mayor of Norman. And the General Fund emergency reserve appropriation has been expended or obligated for expenditure. Okay, so the tornado has come through, the ice storm has happened, the big flood has happened, and it's caused us to have these extraordinary expenses. The City Council can appropriate rainy day fund balance in those circumstances. Or number 2, the general fund operating reserve is projected to be drawn down to a level below 1% of annually budgeted expenditures due to sustained revenue fluctuations or unexpected expenditures. And again, that's where, where I'm hearing this just tap the rainy day fund, that's where you would be tapping it, under this section, because we would be drawing down the general fund reserve below 1%. That's a dire emergency that has been foisted upon us, not because council didn't act, but because we're not able to implement the actions that council took. This is an emergency situation, so yes, you can tap into the rainy day fund. Or number 3, critical non-programmed one-time capital expenditures are required for the maintenance, replacement, construction, or improvement of City of Norman buildings or infrastructure. The example that we've given here is a lightning strike has happened and wiped out all of the city's computer equipment. Now, that's not a federally declared disaster. It's not even a state declared disaster, but it would certainly be a disaster for us because we have to spend millions of dollars to replace all the city's computer equipment. You can tap into the rainy day fund balance in that situation. But I get concerned, and you, as financial fiduciaries for the city, should be as concerned as me when this cavalier just tap the rainy day fund balance is talked about. It's not a cavalier situation to tap into the rainy day fund. And when council implemented this policy, you did that with a very dire purpose in mind, and you put these strings attached to yourselves before you could do it, and you put this other string on there for a very good reason. Look at number C there in your ordinance. At any time that the net revenue stabilization fund balance is below the required 4% of annually budgeted general fund expenditures, the council shall take action to restore the fund balance to its required level within 3 years of the occurrence of the shortfall, and will seek to maintain the fund at 5% of annually budgeted general fund expenditures. So again, when we get to this point in the fiscal year, every year that I've been here, and every year since this ordinance was adopted in 2010, we've been talking about getting the fund up to its minimum level, getting the fund balance in the rainy day fund up to its targeted level. And for the last fiscal years, we've been talking about, do we make a deposit to the rainy day fund to keep it at its targeted level? I don't want you to make a light decision to draw on the rainy day fund. That is a very imprudent decision. And it is an extremely imprudent decision to draw the rainy day fund balance below its minimum level. Because if you do that, going back to the previous page that we just looked at in the general fund, when we were talking about the fiscal year 21 budget, and in order to adopt next year's budget, you have to fill a $3.3 million hole. If you tap into the rainy day fund balance below its minimum level, you have just exacerbated that problem, because you have to repay whatever you take out of the rainy day fund that draws it down below its minimum over the next fiscal years, okay? You've just made your problems that much worse if you tap into the rainy day fund. So I don't want you to do that and think that there's no downside of doing it. There is. So let's look at the rainy day fund. That's the last page that you have here. In column C, you see that we started this fiscal year with a rainy day fund balance of $3.8 million roughly, which was about $90,000 above where we thought that rainy day fund balance would be. We think that we'll bring in about $65,000 of interest this year, so we project that the rainy day fund balance will close this fiscal year with a balance of $3.859 million. Dropping down below the line there, then you see that that is about $496,000 above the minimum rainy day fund balance, and about $344,000 short of the targeted rainy day fund balance. So again, we have a different discussion this year. Instead of this committee, as we have done every January for the last 10 years, talked about making a deposit to the rainy day fund balance to $344,000 to bring it up to its targeted level, we're talking about drawing it down. And I am suggesting that you would not want to draw it down by more than that $496,000. So we have a dire situation, and it's a dire situation not of our own making, because council took the action to address that situation when you adopted the changes to the TIF project plan back in November, but that has been held in abeyance. So what I was directed to look at was some ways that we might address, if I need more copies, ways that I might address this financial emergency that's been foisted upon us. And when we discussed this back in November, council made it very clear to me that you did not want to have any proposals before you that laid off current employees or that furloughed current employees. Okay, so I took that as a parameter when I was preparing this proposed list, and it's just that. It's a proposal. It's only, I've ran this by a few people, but it's not anything that's official or anything that has been enacted yet. It's just for your committee's consideration, but it is a step in the direction of addressing the $5 million problem that we have in the general fund over the next 2 fiscal years, okay? The fiscal year that we're in right now and the budget that we're going to adopt in 2 or 3 months from now. This is not a problem that can be kicked down the curb, Finance Committee, fiduciaries for the city. Okay, please, this is serious. A few things that I'm suggesting we might consider. Let's hope that we don't have a tornado. We haven't spent that 1% emergency reserve this year, and if we don't have to, that would save about $786,000 that is assumed to be spent in this year's budget. Council can consider drawing down the rainy day fund, but again, I would not recommend drawing it down below its minimum level. So if you add to the general fund that $496,000 that is in excess of the minimum, that helps out a little bit. We have some city accounts that are large accounts that we think we can save some money, either through conscious actions or by the price of oil being down a little bit. And those are the things that are before you. Asphalt supplies, we think we can cut that a little bit. Just by good management. The census contract that council approved just Tuesday, we just wouldn't do that. And we would hope to, get a full census count by, Annalise's great work and other staff folks' great work in-house. But we would not hire the contractor that the council approved to be hired on Tuesday. We hope to save some money in our streetlight electricity account. We hope to save some money in our fuel supply account. And I don't like using the word hope. I mean, but that's what we be talking about. Through good management, through external circumstances. When I'm saying let's hope we can save $100,000 in our $1.2 million fuel account, the price of oil is kind of down right now, but if United States bombs Iraq or Iran and the price of oil spikes up, we're not going to make that. Okay, so again, I'm talking.
Incredibly sane president do that.
These are things we hope come to pass and that we can have some savings if we continue on the course that we've been on so far this fiscal year. This is proposing that come this spring, when the grass starts to grow again, we would not hire the contractors that we have budgeted to mow the medians on Flood and on Highway 9 and on Ed Noble Parkway, so forth and so on, and that would save us about $50,000. Down below that, you see where we're freezing the hiring of our summer park mowing staff. Again, I don't want to make light of this. And when I have talked to council and you've asked me, Councilmember Patron, what if we get in this situation where we have to continue to apportion sales tax to the University North Park TIF fund, what if, and I have said difficult decisions would have to be made. Well, these are those difficult decisions. I don't want to make light of what we're talking about here. I'm talking about not mowing the medians. I'm talking about in the parks, the grass is going to be growing and we're going to mow it, I don't know what the exact, every 3 weeks instead of every 2 weeks. And so we're going to have weeds in the parks. I mean, I don't make light of what we're talking about here. Because if these things are implemented and you live next door to a park, there's going to be weeds in your backyard as tall as an elephant's eye. I mean, and you, council members, are going to get calls about that. I don't want to make light of what I'm proposing here. But these are dire situations that have been foisted upon us, and we have to take dire actions to respond to them. The city attorney's here. I'm talking about saving $50,000 in our outside legal account. So far this year, we have not had to hire outside legal as much as we have in the past. I'm hoping that we can save some money there. You see that we're proposing to cut out the mosquito control program in its entirety. That would save us about $25,000 per year. The Norman Day fireworks, we just wouldn't do that. We have budgeted $15,000 for an outside contractor instructor to present programs at the senior center. We haven't spent any of that money, so I'm proposing we just wouldn't spend it, we freeze it. We have an on-staff veterinarian now, so we haven't had to do the contract spay-neuter program. We cut that out. We have some other things proposed for next fiscal year. Remember, this is a long-term problem that has been foisted upon us that we're having to address. So what I'm proposing next fiscal year is a carry forward of some of the things that I just talked about, but also next month at this meeting, we're going to talk about those outside agencies that we have been funding each fiscal year for the last, 15 years or so. We would propose to cut that out, just not do that next year. And again, I'm a board member of the Norman Arts Council. I don't take lightly the proposal of not continuing funding to the Firehouse Arts Center and the Sooner Theater and the Historical Museum, but that's what we're talking about here. That is external to the base mission of our city's general fund, and we wouldn't continue to do that. The social and voluntary services funding for the Center for Children and Families after-school programs, we cut those things out, just wouldn't do them, because we can't afford to do them anymore because of this this problem that's been foisted upon us. Again, these are not easy things. And notice that when I am talking about a $5 million problem that we have to address by the time we adopt the budget 3 months from now, these dire things that I'm just talking about is only getting us halfway there. Okay, so I'll turn it over to your discussion now. Any questions that you have? If I went too fast, or any questions that you have about the base presentation, please give them to me. I'll try to respond to them. And then as a committee, we hope to get some direction about these proposals, any of them that you're just, as a committee, uncomfortable with, or if you're okay with them, and let's move forward. But I would just, again, if I have misspoken in any way, I'm going to ask Catherine if she can say, as it relates to the petition process and the legal challenge to that petition process, if I have misspoken in any way, to please correct me.
Councilmember Wilson.
We have a pending sale for the property where Norman Regional is. Where are we on that?
So, Your Honor, conversations have taken place with hospital administrators in their discussions about the acquisition. They're weighing their current lease on that property versus the acquisition, and their acquisition prepared to move forward conditioned on our desire to move the senior wellness facility to the Porter campus as kind of a catalyst for the redevelopment of the Porter campus. So they've been having some meetings with some folks as it relates to that particular.
We're requiring
After
that,
the
or
fact.
they're wanting
That
to
is
require
their
it?
desire
Their
to make
desire.
that real property acquisition make real good sense in their budget.
Okay, and then I have additional questions I asked. So, what was the timeline then?
I think the ad hoc committee, the senior wellness group, will be meeting on that subject here in the next 4 or 5 weeks. They wanted to make sure they had all the i's dotted, but I think they're going to take a tour group up to OKC and kind of get an idea about the wellness component and how that would fit well next to Norman Regional Facility. So the ad hoc committee, I think, will have that conversation here very soon.
Okay, what would we have done different had we not, as a council, decided to end the TIF and put those funds back in? I mean, can you remember back what we were talking about back then?
Yeah,
And-
we have been on this course for a year and a half.
We've been on this course for 10 years.
You've been on this course for at least 7 years, yeah. But yeah, the actual, adopted policies and resolutions and ordinances, we've been on this course for about a year and a half. So looking back a year and a half, and yes, I have been presenting a long-term negative expenditures outweighing revenues in the general fund for a long time. And as you know, I have always been talking about two areas of major ways to address that. One major way that I was suggesting to address that was implementing a stormwater utility that relieved the general fund of the $3 million of expenses for stormwater that is being paid for out of the general fund. That didn't happen. The second way was to end the apportionment of sales tax to the University North Park TIF fund as quickly as possible. And council started on the course of actually implementing that about a year ago. And you adopted resolutions to direct the city attorney to negotiate with the developers on an agreed-to solution such that we would have enough money in the bank right now to pay for all of the approved projects in the University North Park TIF project plan. And the city attorney did that, and the council adopted that, and you adopted a budget based on that. So where were we before that? You were listening to Anthony crying in the woods about we got problems and we need to address them. Well, we got real big problems now, and we don't have as long to solve them anymore.
Okay, so additionally, I guess, I know that ultimately revenue is the problem because the expenses are kind of what we need generally to do to operate the city and to run our business. So beyond this, what do we do?
This is my best shot. I mean, given the parameter that council placed on us back in November, don't lay off anybody, don't furlough anybody. This is, and again, it's just me. I'm your finance director. This is my shot. I've run it by Daryl. I've run it by a few folks. But this is my best shot, and I am wide open. This idea of using land purchase proceeds on the Porter campus of Norman Regional Hospital has been talked about before, but just remember, in best case, that doesn't happen for 6 to 10 months. We got a problem that we have to address in 2 months or 3 months.
I believe though the other night.
And when we've talked about those funds in the past, y'all have talked about that you wanted to use that money to build the second, third, and fourth, and fifth phases of the senior center in those Norman Forward projects and that sort of thing. So again, that's a different direction, but that's your call. If by some means those funds can come in before we adopt the fiscal year 21 budget and we can put that money into the general fund, that's another potential solution.
Well, I believe I asked specifically in our council meeting when we were making decisions about the TIF, I believe. I asked specifically what the best feeling, and I understand it's a feeling and nothing's solid, and it seems like every time we think we have a foothold on something, that whatever other entity's involved in it rips it out. So I had asked what was the timeline for that possible purchase?
And I said February, remember?
I know,
it's February.
yeah, we're talking 6 months now. 6 months is not
Ago.
February.
It was 6 months ago when I said that.
Okay, well, February's next month now, so I'm not trying to be a jerk. It sounds like it, so I'm sorry.
Nor am I.
But, I know everybody's frustrated. So, and then I made really bad notes on our council meeting on Tuesday, but there was $250,000 worth of crap in that council meeting that we approved.
Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, part of it was the census. I feel like there was something for the sand salt maintenance center bus thing, which I
Yeah,
think.
a lot of that, remember, we're only talking about the general fund here. A lot of that, when we were talking about it, was in the
I got you.
capital fund.
69 for software, is that capital? I don't know.
Yes.
Okay. So, I don't know what point is here, but, as far as this list goes, I would like to see us push along our $4 million. I feel like the TIF would end at the end of this year, would be fully funded, right? The end of
A
this
year from now.
2020.
No,
No?
mid fiscal year 21. We would make apportionments through January or February of calendar year '21 in order to fully fund the $54.7 million of authorized projects as they were back before November.
Okay, well, I guess my 2 cents doesn't help, but that I do not support eliminating outside agency funding or SBSC funding. I know that that's not helpful, but that's my 2 cents. I don't know what the solution is, though.
Councilmember Scott, Holman, Bierman.
Okay. Hi, Anthony. I was watching on my way over here. I know I was late because of traffic and stuff. But so could you clarify a couple of things for me? And then I have a question, I think, for Catherine. So I heard negative 1.7 million somewhere in the general fund. Can you direct me to that page and just kind of reiterate that for me really quick?
Okay, the negative $1.7 million figure that was quoted was where we would end this fiscal year,
2019.
and that's on the third page that you have there,
Perfect.
short of our 3% operating reserve.
Okay, and then, so going, as of right now, we can't move forward, you were saying something because of the, petition that has been brought forward by,
We can't implement the ordinance that council approved in November.
so since we can't implement the ordinance, we are not able to collect the sales tax that rightfully belongs to the city in our general fund. And so that's why we're having this discussion about making these cuts, because
That's
why we're
correct.
having this. Yeah.
Again,
Okay,
and I talked about this last month, but once that petition was filed, I had to make apportionments to make up the apportionments that we would have made in October, November, and December. So I wrote a check to Bank of Oklahoma for $900,000, and that money's gone. So when we look at the monthly reports, you'll see that $1.6 million has been paid over to Bank of Oklahoma this fiscal year that by budget, we wouldn't have had to pay. And that's going to continue. I'm going to make another payment a week or so
can
from
I
now.
interject, please?
Yes.
So that was my train of thought, sorry. So the petition is filed, there's a challenge against the petition, which I don't know if that's delaying the process, but ultimately, we have to put something on the ballot. At some point, we have to come up with ballot language unless the challenge is successful, the challenge to the petition.
Right, so, I sent you all something about this, I think it was last week, but, the petition, the referendum petition has been challenged, the court date is February 24th. If the judge doesn't recuse, if the judge rules right of way, we still are looking at potentially 60 days before we know whether there are any appeals. And if there are appeals, that's a timeline that's out of our control as far as what the Supreme Court does with it. So we could be looking at quite a bit of time before we know the outcome of that challenge.
Of the challenge to the petition or of the petition?
The challenge to the petition,
Probably
and
not
then if
by
the petition
So 60 days. for
survives the
that.
challenge, then it would have to be set
And then
for
it would be going
election.
to the ballot.
And I
And
bet
so
it
that
won't be
doesn't help
by
us.
Right.
It doesn't help us for this fiscal year. So is it possible to withdraw the challenge and then put it on the ballot, let the voters vote, and then we can, possibly, hopefully fix this by allowing, the ordinance that we pass as a council to get our sales tax dollars back? I mean, is that a possibility?
It would be up to the challengers if they wanted to withdraw their challenge. I don't know that it would help us because what the local development act says about when it gets set for election is at the next general municipal election. That is a regularly held election where everyone gets to vote, and for Norman, that's the mayoral election.
Okay.
Or a special election that we call.
That's in a different section of the statutes. That's not applicable to the local development act.
So then,
Next city election, next mayoral election.
next mayoral election's not for a couple of years, so it ultimately
Yep.
doesn't help us at all. So, thank you for that information. This is depressing. My heart rate has risen since I walked in the room because
Welcome to the club.
this is
Through the roof right now.
this is why we did what we did. Because we didn't want to make these cuts. We don't want to make cuts to services. We deserve better. We are supposed to. We have a responsibility to fund our public services, and we're talking about making cuts to them. This is extremely frustrating, and I'm sorry. I'm very tense right now.
Councilmember Holman.
To maybe back to Councilmember Wilson's question about, I think was maybe about when we had our meeting in November, there was a question about when do we think this hospital land sale might take place, and we were told in a few months, 3, 4, 5.
It could definitely happen during the current
I
fiscal
think
year.
that maybe was what.
Yeah, so the appraisals have happened. And that's usually the part that takes the longest. Escrow could be a relatively short exercise.
Well, okay, so that's, yeah,
Yeah,
thank you, Stephen, for
wondering
clarification.
when would we maybe get that?
We're hoping to bring that conversation back to the council in just the next handful of weeks. Purchase and sales agreement would be the next step the council would approve on a regularly scheduled agenda.
They don't have to sell it.
They don't have to sell it. They have a lease that is intact and they pay $1 a year. So obviously that's attractive, but they see community benefit from
But
the
they committed
transaction.
to selling it.
Aye.
I
They
mean,
buy it,
buying, I'm
yes.
sorry,
We sell.
buying, we're selling.
Yes.
Bierman, Hall, Scott.
So my first thing is that this is the first I have heard about any additional conditions attached to the sale of the Norman Regional Hospital land.
yeah,
And
mine
to
too.
me, that is what raised my blood pressure today. That is what did it. Because there was ample opportunity for them to come clean with that news before they asked us to make the decision that we made several months ago that they know we weren't super thrilled about making. So I'm going to put that out there because that, to me, that is symbolic of everything that we've been dealing with these last couple of years. So
Playing a chess
that's
game
what's
with
lighting a
half the
fire under
board.
me right now. I have several, and thankfully I wrote them down, so at least I remember them all. One of them, Councilmember Wilson already asked. My question is, does the current budget projection include revenue from the transit tax that'll start being collected in March? I think it is.
April, we'll get our first payment in June. And yes, it is recorded in the public transit fund,
Okay,
not in the
great.
general fund.
So, and I'm not entirely sure how to phrase this question because I don't know the financial terms that go along with it. But when projects that are funded with general fund dollars end, if they come in under budget, where does the balance of that money go? Is it put back in the general fund or does it sit in its tagged account, project, fund, what have you?
Okay, see, you're using the word project, which indicates to me capital project. And there are very few capital projects paid for out of the general fund. But where you have under expenditures in the general fund, it goes into the general fund balance.
Okay, because that was going to be my question is, do we have a set of funds that maybe have small balances in them from allocations, maybe expenditures that come in under budget? So let's say we're going to buy something from one of the general fund accounts, and we think we have authorized the expenditure of $250,000 for it, but Sean, with his good looks and deep voice, is able to get a 25% discount. Where does that money go? Does that just go back into the general
Goes
fund?
back into the general fund. But
Okay.
now remember, when we adopted this year's budget, you made an assumption on line 59 of some of those savings.
Okay. So,
500,000.
Is the quickly a follow-up, is it also true for the capital fund? So if it didn't originate from general fund, if it originated from capital fund and it was a project, and
It goes
there's
to the
no more
capital
work
fund
being
balance.
done, then it just goes back to,
The capital fund balance,
okay. So it just depends on where it originated.
yes.
is there a way to easily explain how we ended up with a fund balance that was $2 million higher for the start of this fiscal year than we thought?
Through good management, Sean's deep voice, and,
And his good looks
Good looks and that sort of thing.
and bargain shopping.
That's how I
Okay.
get through it too.
Because that was, I'm not gonna, obviously we can't assume that these things are going to happen year to year, but
yeah,
I
we
would
didn't spend the
assume,
emergency reserve last year. That was a big chunk of it.
okay, that was also something I thought might have been included in that, so, okay, that makes sense. And so then my last question is I'm basically asking Councilmember Wilson's question in a different way. Where was the $4 million in TIF apportionment spent in our budget? Did we,
throughout the general fund.
so we didn't go and spend 4 million extra dollars on nice to haves or cars or
No.
anything like that?
No.
So this was a budget hold that we
Remember,
would have had.
when we were adopting last year's budget, the discussion was about how are we going to make up that hole? And yes, council said we're going to take action such that we can stop apportioning sales tax July 1st.
All right, and I just wanted to make sure that that was clear, that this wasn't, we didn't take 4 million extra dollars and go and hire a ton of new people or build a whole bunch of new buildings, that this is a problem that we had been trying to address for years.
Absolutely.
This was one possible way to do it. And so now here we are. My last question is, I see no reference to, and frankly, I think it's probably deeper in these spreadsheets than I was able to look. How much have we spent out of the Parkland Development Fund and the Parks and Rec Capital Improvement Fund this year?
I don't have that in front of me, but again, those are only for park development projects.
And there's no transferability that is in the general fund, however, correct?
No, that's in the Parkland Development Fund.
Oh, it's an entirely separate fund. Okay, that was really my question, I assumed it was in the general fund, and so it is entirely separate from
Fund
that,
52.
similar to a enterprise fund in that way. Thank you. And then, oh, no, that was it, because Councilmember Wilson asked that one. Great.
Councilmember Hall.
I want to circle back to the city manager on the land acquisition.
Yes.
So I just want to make sure, I mean, I think we've said it a couple different ways, but I want to make sure that what you're saying is that the current negotiation for the sale of the property on the Porter campus now has a condition attached to it to move the senior center there.
At the appraised value, and it appraised at $5,080,000, I think, for the entire 11 acres. As our conversation initiated, we were talking about the 7 point some odd acres that was under lease, and when we discovered the bigger piece, requested the appraisal on the bigger piece. And that was the path we were on. After November, the question was, could we move the senior wellness center to that facility? And
Right.
we thought, I don't know if that had ever come up in the conversation with the ad hoc group. We kind of walked ourselves through an exercise about where the conversation started. Central Library, a couple of different park sites, and then settled on Reeves. And we did a little background work ourselves to find out, was Reeves' site okay, we'll take that, or was that the place where the senior said, we really, really, really want it there? And it didn't appear that that site was, overwhelmingly the favorite. It was just better than the other sites examined. So when the request came in from hospital administrators, could we consider moving it? I said, well, I think where we are in the construction drawings, what we have is fairly portable. It's just a different site plan, but I don't think any of the mechanics of what the ad hoc committee wants to build would necessarily have to change. So I said, we haven't had that conversation with the ad hoc committee yet, but there's definitely an interest on the part of the hospital to make that investment at the Porter campus site.
No, I understand that, but to me, there's a big difference with the city of Norman deciding to relocate to that site than having that be a condition from the Norman Regional Health System that the only way they're going to purchase is if we do that. So I'm just making sure I understand what you're saying.
There at the time, in the last handful of weeks, the urgency of having to make that decision, it wasn't near as interesting as it is today with the status of court dates on the petition and that type of thing. So it's definitely much more a grave conversation today than it was at the time the question was raised. But it'll definitely change our negotiations on the subject, that we need that real property transaction to take place with or without.
So we will be forced to meet that condition.
Well, I would say they put that on the table, and we were gonna have the conversation with the seniors, and if they thought, ooh, that's a better place, then by
Right.
all means, we were gonna go recommend that. So, we'll approach it in two fronts. One, accelerate the conversation with the senior ad hoc center, and two, we need a or else conversation about that real property transaction.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Thank you.
Is that it, Councilmember Hall?
Yes.
Okay, are yours follow-ups on this one? Okay, Councilmember Holman?
Okay, we have a number in our mind about what we think that our land is worth that we might get through a sale. But if we decide we want to build the senior center there, do we then have to, do we purchase land? Do they give us the land?
The initial thought
The
was,
is what we're gonna get less, because that's factored into it?
the thought was
'Cause
we
that
could do
impacts the
a, like
budget here
a
if we're gonna be using this
dollar a
to fill
year
it.
land lease kind of a thing, if that were to be the case, that they would still be one ownership of the entire property instead of, you know, cutting it back up in different ways. That if that were to be the case, our initial thought is we would lease the footprint under the building.
They would buy our property from us that we have now, and then we would lease $1 a year from Norman Regional Hospital and build a city building there.
Yeah, and it wouldn't, because it's a thing that's not
It's not unheard
platted.
of, but yeah.
Yeah, it's not platted currently, so that the thing we would lease would not resemble any of the pieces we would sell. So,
Right.
yeah, there's a lot of community development type work that would have to go into that, you know, contract long before construction started.
Okay, so that'd be my concern, I guess, is if we're talking about using those funds for potentially filling a budget hole. If we're gonna build a city building over there, are we gonna get the full amount? Do we have to buy property back or lease it? What does that cost?
Yeah, still talking that $5,080,000 number.
Is yours a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
What I wonder is, and maybe I'm grasping at straws, but assuming that we pursued this, we have some investment in the Reeves location. Is there anything to be realized by making a decision to accept that deal? We'll realize a payment, which will help us, but maybe we forego expenses that might have accrued to the Reeves location in the process.
A couple of things. Timing in terms of removing a facility that currently sits on the Reeves Park. And the other piece, when the issue was raised, you know, our first thought was, from staff's perspective, we were preparing a request for proposal for operators of the Senior Wellness Center. When the request was, could we talk about moving the building there? Our initial response was, that makes more sense to us if you intend to operate the facility. If I'm gonna participate in a wellness program, and I know I have medical professionals monitoring and tracking and, you know, keeping us on a path, especially if that meant I didn't have to pay a membership fee, that may be seen as a very positive step in that direction. So I think there could be some savings to the users of the facility by not having to necessarily subscribe.
And I'm grasping at straws again, looking for some near-term savings, if you will. And just as an aside, I know that Dave Beck's Senior Legion, whatever he's calling it, is meeting as we
Right
speak
now.
on this very subject at the library.
With Richie Split.
Yes.
Well, that's good. Right?
And I also know from having corresponded with Beck that he is at least generally favorable. He personally, I don't mean to misrepresent it, but him personally is warming to the split proposal, for whatever it's worth.
Councilmember Scott?
So, comments and questions. Wondering, I'm thinking that the whole hospital thing, you know, we wanted to get the money from the sale, and I don't think it's, you know, on them or to balance our city budget. You know, it's on us. We're the stewards, and so I'm wondering also if we do go through the sale and everything, would it be prudent to use the proceeds to fill our budget gap?
From an accounting education perspective, when you find one-time money, it's
No.
best to use it for one-time activities like capital. The instructors would tell us that what we are looking at is the beginnings of a structural deficit in the budget, And it's not, we're almost paying our Visa card with the MasterCard to use one-time money to fill what could become a structural problem in the budget. So our education would tell us not a good use of those one-time dollars.
Thank you. And then, so I serve on the OML Legislative Committee, and we discussed some things that they're going to be pushing at the Capitol. And I wish I had my other notebook because I had the House bill and everything. But it gave me, I'm thinking about it now, it gives me a question about, do we have the ability to draw a district or do a bond, some sort of revenue bond, or a bond that would bring in, I don't know, more revenue somehow to kind of fill in these holes? Trying to think out of the box.
No,
because
the principle of a revenue bond is that there's a revenue source to pay it
revenue
back.
yeah.
And here, where we have a lack of revenue, no, I can't sell a revenue bond on no revenue.
we can't do any, we don't have anything. Okay, that is my only other question, really.
Councilmember Holman?
Are we factoring in the cost we've talked about that we're gonna need for the bus maintenance facility, the transit hub that we're gonna have to construct, and the cost of fleet replacement in regard to the bus system?
That'd be capital.
We've talked about in the millions of dollars for those items.
No, that's not part of this general fund discussion. That is a problem that will be confronted, but it's in the capital budget.
So we have those issues, and we potentially are gonna have to find money to buy land for a swimming pool and a gymnasium. We need more money for the senior center, and we have a budget shortfall. The hospital money, to me, doesn't sound like it's enough to cover all that, even with these cuts. And that's if we cut all of it.
I would clarify, that's also if we don't have an emergency that
More than
requires
just the budget,
$786,000.
budget shortfall that we're dealing with.
Councilmember Wilson?
So how I understand what I would support using the hospital money for, if we ever get it, that would not be to plug a hole rather permanently, rather to bridge the hole until we get our actual money coming back to our revenue, to our fund. And then paint for me, Anthony, that picture once we get through all this stupid court crap and get our sales tax dollars back where they should have been to begin with in our general fund. What does that look like?
At a
for our
very
future?
elementary level, yeah, what you're talking about is that we thought we were going to have to apportion $3.5 million less in sales tax this fiscal year and $1.5 million less next fiscal year. That's $5 million of sales tax that is going to the TIF fund that we thought would not go to the TIF fund. And yes, by a very elementary, you could say if we get $5 million coming in, it covers that hole.
And it
And
is
then
discretionary.
going forward from that place, though, what does that look like? I understand that we have a sort of, well, if I understand it correctly, we have sales tax revenues that are flattening, not necessarily declining, but we are projecting, or had been projecting maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago, a greater increase than what actually happened or is happening, and we're trending flat. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, so with that flat trend and we return sales tax back to the general fund, beyond all of this, do we need to continue cutting? I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, that this is a solvable problem. I know it's probably not gonna be easy solvable problem. We have some hurdles legally to get through. We have a sale to get through. As somebody that just recently imported trees from China, I'm feeling very victorious about these kinds of things. I think we can do it. I know that you're a very talented person, but I wanna solve these problems for our posterity, for our future. What do we do?
Posterity, we have to broaden our revenue base. And again, And oh, by the way, the sales tax projection for fiscal year '21 is based on 4% growth and in the out years, and so that's going to change in the negative way.
Especially when.
For
things
prosperity
like-
purposes, we have to stop tying ourselves to sales tax. We need to broaden our revenue base in some way. You know, paying for capital stuff with general obligation bonds instead of sales tax. You know, that's what we have to do, because again, this
Tell me
is
that last part again. General obligation
paying
bonds.
for capital projects. You know, we have a capital sales tax that we're depending on to pay for our capital stuff as well.
1%?
0.7%.
Got it.
We need to wean ourselves away from sales tax to the extent that we can, and just think differently, okay, my opinion. And I've been saying that for a long time. But again, to the extent that, you know, 2/3 of our general fund revenue base is sales tax, and that's, you know, no way around that right now. So we have to deal with those realities right now to adopt a budget next year.
So OML people, we need y'all to talk to the state about,
Municipal income tax?
no,
Is that what I heard?
no, not municipal.
This is all your
Good?
fault.
Hey, Governor Stitt's from Norman, maybe he'll
I'm trying to solve our problem.
consider our
Okay.
problem.
Councilmember Bierman?
If you want me to vote, you have to
Catherine,
promise.
I think this one's a question for you. Aside from uncertainties with election dates and things like that, let's say that does extend well past when we think it would extend. What happens when it funds?
When it funds, and that's why Anthony, I think, shows projections through January or February, when it fully funds under the 2006 plan, by state statute, we can stop the increments without violating
So
referendum.
regardless of what happens with a court case or referendums or when election dates would be, even if it's 2022, as soon as the 54.75 million is collected, that gets returned to the general fund.
Right, from that point forward.
From that
And
point
I think
forward.
that's reflected in Anthony's.
Right, I just wanted to make sure that we all knew that regardless of when the referendum is sorted out, we will have the increment restored to the general fund no later than January 2021, a year from now. So I agree with Councilmember Wilson that I feel like this is a solvable problem. A second question probably for you also, Catherine. If council wanted to, could we take different action on the TIF?
No.
Okay, I'm glad to know that. I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that. We did, however, once previously use one-time found TIF funds to fill a budget gap. That's why we didn't have to do this last year, because we found $4 million and got us through last budget cycle. So there's even precedent to, well, yeah, I guess 2 years ago, because we're now starting the next one. And we need to stop with the 4% growth. I don't know how we change that, but I think it should end now because we know for a fact that we're not getting there.
And when we adopt the budgets, we haven't been doing that. But for the out-year projections, you're saying we need to stop.
I even think with the out-year projections, I think that our recent history has shown, you know, when I got on council 2.5 years ago,
Yeah.
I mean, now we're
not
still
gonna return to the old normal.
No,
'Cause
that's not going to happen. So I think even in the out years, we need to have a more accurate reflection of what we're seeing now. I don't feel ready to make any of these decisions today or really give any guidance. What I think we need to do is have a well-advertised public hearing about this. I want to hear from the public because in the end, they're the ones who are going to feel the result of this. And I really think that we need to show them all of this, show them what is going on, and have them come to us and say, do you like any of this? Are you okay with any of this? If not, where do we go? Because I've heard a lot of feedback from different people about things that are totally unapplicable, like why are we even paying for recycling anymore? And, you know, put that money back. I'm like, well, it doesn't go back where it would actually do any good, but I understand where they're coming from. And I think we need to not just do things here at this table. I think we need to do things in that room where people can come and give us their opinions. Because this isn't just gonna hurt us to make this decision, and I think we need to be making a doubled, tripled, quadrupled concerted effort to get some public buy-in for whatever we decide.
All right, Councilmember Patron?
Anthony, can you counsel us on the interfund transfers here and what we're spending, to prop up other accounts?
What line numbers are you looking at?
I assume it's line 44 through 51?
Okay, so the Westwood Fund transfer is to pay for any shortfalls in the Westwood Enterprise Fund. There is no transfer from the general fund to the capital fund. A lot of these are some year in the past, we made that transfer, and so the line stays on here for
Yeah,
history
you can,
purposes.
if it's a hash mark.
But like
we
the
don't need to
public
go
safety sales tax fund transfer is the subsidy to the public safety sales tax fund, where the public safety sales tax fund is short of meeting its expenses, and the general fund is paying the difference.
And of that, last year, around $500,000 was overtime?
In the
Correct.
PSST fund is probably less than that. I think the total expenditure for over expenditure for overtime was about 1.1, and I suspect that the PSST portion of that was probably 150, 200,000. We'd have to find the exact number, and you may have looked it up, so, but I haven't.
So of the, just for the budget year 20, we have 575,800 going to Westwood and 1.129 going to PSST. Correct?
Yes.
Okay, so is that a breakdown on the pool? Like, is that, where is the revenue? What of that, when we go up to the revenue side, is, can we get a breakdown on
Yeah,
what's?
I would say the majority of that is the golf operation, the tennis operation, and the pool operation break even at worst.
Okay, so it's about the same as the rainy day fund minimum, $500,000 either way. Okay, so I feel the same as Kate does. I mean, I want to go through these numbers. I can't just give you, in 15 minutes. This is how, I want to actually go through it, because I'm a weirdo like that. So I really appreciate all of the information that you've given us, and I hope to get to meet with you soon, and
Name the time, I'll be there.
thank you.
All right, Councilmember Scott?
Anthony, how would you suggest we go about diversifying our revenue stream to a general fund?
I don't think I should say in this setting,
Oh, okay.
Ad valorem.
other than to say paying for capital projects with general obligation bonds instead of sales tax.
But the capital projects don't come out of our general fund.
Correct,
So they come out of the capital improvement,
but that's a sales tax
yeah.
right now.
So use those, and so then could we then apportion, if we were to be able to pay for capital projects out of the general obligation bonds, instead, we could apportion the sales tax from the capital improvement plan or budget into.
That would take a vote of the people, but yes.
But, okay.
Councilmember Wilson?
Okay, well, I have a different question, but I want to, that's intriguing. A vote of the people to change the apportionment of.
To change the use of the capital sales tax. Instead of it being a capital sales tax, it would be a general purpose sales tax.
Okay. The Westwood, back to the Westwood, Enterprise Fund, why is that $500,000? Why, what is it that it's supposed to be an enterprise fund, why are we putting $500,000 into it from the general?
We had this discussion several years ago about the golf course operation, and did we want to continue to have a first-class municipal golf course? And the council's decision was that you wanted to. And so,
Wouldn't,
well,
go ahead.
no.
When
just,
you're finished,
know,
I got another question, so I just want to.
That's it, that's really,
Well, wouldn't it be more prudent to
That's not the
charge better
debt.
fees, like appropriate fees?
start again.
Wouldn't it be more prudent to charge the fees that are appropriate for the people that use that?
Well, I'm getting into Judd's area here, but the elasticity is an economic term. The elasticity of golf course fees is extremely high. And you have to stay competitive with, Early Wine and the Purcell Golf Course. If you raise the fees way above,
Then you get a tipping point.
then they will go to Purcell or they will go to Early Wine.
Yeah, but we're going near $1 million. I'm thinking maybe we as a city, we can't afford a golf course.
Your call.
Just that.
Councilor Bierman?
That was actually partly going to be my question, because I was the one who brought it up a couple years ago and had a couple very devout golfers tell me how much they didn't like that. But if it's an enterprise fund, I think it should be able to stand alone. That's
Somewhat.
what our enterprise funds do. What would happen if we didn't subsidize it? What happens if we didn't actually send over $575,000 while also looking at this list? And if Westwood isn't on this list, how do we justify this and no fireworks?
The decision has been, at least in the past, that having a municipal golf course was a priority. Fireworks have been a priority. Again, if the decision of council or the direction of council was cut the general fund subsidy to the Westwood Fund, that would, get us $500,000 further down this list. And that's a very good direction that we could take, and understand that that's a difficult decision, but that's one that you can make.
I don't think it should be off the table. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I don't think it
that
should be off
that's,
the table either.
if all of these things are on the table and cutting social and voluntary services is on the table, I think that cutting the subsidy to Westwood and requiring them to figure it out, I think should also be on the table.
Councilor Holman?
I know it's not related, but the debt on the golf course, how much longer?
Not very, but now remember, the debt is paid for really from the room tax fund.
Where major improvements were made to the golf course in the early 2000s that we're still paying off. So that would be something to be maybe mindful of if we decided
paid
to
off
close it.
June
We're still
1st
having
of-
to pay for improvements that we made to it years ago.
June, did you say, Anthony?
June 1st of '22.
22, it's 2 more years. But I mean, I agree. I mean, I think there is a quality of life component of having it that people may make Norman more attractive to people that I can understand. But
It's not
in
the trend.
tough budgetary times, I mean, when we are having to look at things like this, I mean, that is something that would be hard to justify, that we're cutting services, but we're going to keep the golf course open. So, I mean, that is going to be a tough one, but we're definitely going to have to consider it.
Your Honor, to follow up on Councilmember Holman's statement, and this for my edification, Anthony, in the budget, are there any pieces of debt that the general fund is supporting that may be maturing in the next couple of years where council could decide to take a one-time bucket of money and pay off that debt early, and we experience a general fund revenue relief or an expenditure relief on a little bucket of debt service like
No,
that?
there's no debt service being paid for out of the general fund.
Got it.
But there's, go ahead, I'll skip ahead for people, sorry.
You're fine, I don't care if you
Yeah,
do.
go ahead.
So you mentioned the
I
room
was
tax.
actually gonna talk.
You
for
are
once.
fine.
Sorry, I was gonna try and jump in. How many people work at Westwood?
At the golf course, there are five full-time maintenance people and 5 or 6, mostly permanent part-time or permanent part-time in the golf shop.
I would say full-time equivalent of about 9.
4 in the golf shop,
Nine
Nine.
full-time equivalent bodies.
Okay.
five maintenance, 4 golf shop.
That includes the part-time, full-time equivalent.
Okay, and then the plan that you've proposed, I just wanna make clear, assumes we have no natural disasters.
assumes that we don't have to spend the emergency savings.
How
the
often
emergency
have we had to spend that? Because you said it came back last year.
Yeah, we did not spend it. We have not spent it for the last 2 or 3 years, but there was 2 or 3 years in a row that we spent it. So kind of depends on floods and tornadoes. I mean,
We're rolling the dice on the weather in the state of Oklahoma.
Gotta roll the dice on something.
Right. Okay, those are my questions, and just a reminder, I have to leave in 5 minutes, so Councilmember Scott, when I hop up, if you could come down here. Councilmember Patron?
Okay, just so I'm clear on that, you're saying draw the rainy day fund down to 500,000, or 400?
by 500,000.
So by 5, so not all the way down.
Correct.
So
Drawing it
leaving
down
the
to its
money
minimum.
for-
level.
I'm talking about two different things.
Yeah, he's the reserve versus rainy day. He's saying take the rainy day down, and the emergency savings, we're drawing down 786.
That's all we budgeted for.
Yeah, that's a budgeted expenditure right now. And
Right.
this is assuming that you don't have to spend that.
Okay, my original question, you brought up the room tax fund paying, can you explain that that's its own little animal there that I'm not as familiar with. So it pays the golf course, half of it goes to Visit Norman, right?
Yes, goes to,
Okay, and is that, it was passed at the ballot like in 1980,
yes.
and 50%, as the ballot language is 50%?
That's a council policy.
That's a council
What-
policy.
What the ordinance says is that the purpose of the room tax is for the attraction of convention and tourism with, and I could look up the actual wording, the uses for park development and arts and humanities are thus anticipated. So in acting that language, council set a policy probably back in 1980 to say that 50% would go towards convention and tourism. You implement that through a contract with Visit Norman, Norman Convention and Visitors Bureau. 25% will go to arts and humanities. You implement that through a contract with the Norman Arts Council. And 25% will go to park development. Of the 25% that is going to park development, for several years now, you have been using some or all of that money to pay the debt service on the improvements that were made to the golf course in 2002.
Okay, so that is paying that. But that pie is split up since 1980. That's just kind of the allocation that council thought was appropriate at that time.
Yes,
Okay, and that's a $2 million budget.
roughly.
Thank you.
Councilmember Wilson?
So back to the Westwood, what's the revenue stream that, I know that the water part does better, right, than the golf? Of course, that's all part of the enterprise fund altogether, am I correct there?
Except tennis is not actually, but yes,
Tennis is not in that.
but golf course and pool
Golf
are.
course and pool are in it together?
Yes.
And the pool carries more of its weight than the golf course? Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes.
I would ask Judd that, yeah.
Judd's saying yes back there, so. And have we ever considered, and what would be the implications of considering privatization of the golf course portion?
We have talked about that, and the contracts that are available haven't proven to be any less expensive, because the contractors are typically not willing to take on our equipment. And then on top of that, so we have to maintain the equipment, and so we continue to do that as we do now. But and we often would have to replace more equipment. They would have a minimum amount of equipment to replace annually. And typically, they would have a minimum amount of capital improvements annually that we're not doing necessarily. And so at the end of the comparison, at the end of the day, if you will, we're spending as much or more to contract somebody to operate, to
Well,
do what we're already doing.
I guess my privatization and your privatization are a little different, and mine is more in the line of offloading it.
Selling it.
And with, so I guess maybe my question should be, what portion above and beyond this $500,000 do we spend towards running the golf course itself? I think we've talked about this before, and I don't remember what those numbers are, and
It's about $1 million operation.
so if we,
Over that.
if we got rid of the golf course or sold it to, and please, everybody, don't get all upset, I'm just asking questions to educate me. If we sold the golf course to a private golf course company, would it be valuable to them in that capacity? Can we do that? Do we have any kind of restrictions on that land as a donated land or anything like that, that we couldn't do that? And if we were to do that, could we make a covenant that says it has to be a public course, it can't be a country club, or anything like that? And then doesn't that free up $1 million plus this 500,000?
When we sold the bonds for Westwood, we mortgaged the land, and we mortgaged the land based on its development property for residential development. So, at least from the standpoint of the tax exempt bonds that we sold, if we were to sell off the land, it would not be to operate as a golf course. It would be for residential development.
See, my eyes narrow, I'm not sure I understand that. We couldn't sell it off as a golf course?
The land is mortgaged.
Or is it worth
The
more?
land is mortgaged. We would
For
have to
another
pay
year.
off the debt.
Oh, it's
Covered, we can't
mortgage.
sell it.
I got you, okay, I missed that.
2 more years. we
Till
could.
2022, yeah.
But till 2022.
Or until we pay off the bonds. I mean,
Yeah.
if you wanted to sell off the golf course land,
Well, then you just pay the bond once you sold it.
yes,
Okay.
but just understand that the value is not to operate as a golf course. A private operator is not gonna make a profit on that golf course any more than we are. So if the land sells, it would sell for residential development, not for operation as a golf course.
Any other questions on this one, or comments?
Probably, but they're not coming to me.
So-
For direction, and
Yeah.
I'll look over my shoulder for the city clerk, council would like a notice public hearing on this conversation is what I heard. If there is consensus to do that, that's something that we'll put on the
yes.
calendar and make it happen.
When could we do that?
Maybe more than one person will come.
So,
At least we can say that we tried.
Comes to our budget hearings every year. One
Councilmember
person,
Patron? Sorry, I know Brenda was gonna,
Maybe they all decide and look here.
Do you want me to answer?
go ahead, sorry.
You could do it as early as next Tuesday, in lieu of your regular study session. What your topics are next Tuesday is a transit update that Sean really needs to give to you. And then, the chairman of the Charter Commission is coming to present their report to you with what they've done to date. You could still do all three, I guess. It would just be for a long night. I mean, it's up to you.
We have
I might
regular long
need a
nights.
little bit more time to go over these.
Do you wanna ask your question or come back to that? Or is this-
Well, the question on the debt service, I just thought I would say that for the Westwood, it looks like we're paying $205,882 a year,
That sounds right.
just because that came up earlier.
Yep.
On the, whether or not we have it on Tuesday, I mean, I will cram as much as I can on going through all of these by Tuesday, but if we can have a little bit more time than 3 days.
Could be a
and 4
special
days,
meeting
that'd be
potentially.
awesome.
Could we do it next Thursday?
Sure.
Like the
But I
following
would
Tuesday.
say that for the Westwood, it looks like we're paying $205,882
But
a year.
noticed.
That sounds right.
Noticed,
Right,
because that came up earlier.
And you could do it.
On the, whether or not we have it on Tuesday, I mean, I will cram as much as I can on going through all of these by Tuesday, but if we can have a little bit more time than 3
Could be a
days.
special meeting potentially.
Could we do it next Thursday?
That'll be busy. Like the
But I
following
would
Tuesday.
say that for the Westwood, it looks like we're paying $205,882 a year.
Noticed.
Noticed, because that came up earlier. On the, whether or not we have it on Tuesday, I mean, I will cram as much as I can on going through all of these by Tuesday, but if we can have a little bit more time than 3
Could be a
days.
special meeting potentially. That'll be busy. Like the
But I
following
would
Tuesday.
say that for the Westwood, it looks like we're paying $205,882 a year.
Noticed.
Noticed, because that came up earlier. On the, whether or not we have it on Tuesday, I mean, I will cram as much as I can on going through all of these by Tuesday, but if we can have a little bit more time than 3
Could be a
days.
special meeting potentially. That'll be busy. Like the
I would, say that, for the Westwood, it looks like we're paying $205,882 a year. Because that came up earlier. On the, whether or not we have it on Tuesday, I mean, I will cram as much as I can on going through all of these by Tuesday, but if we can have a little bit more time than great. But I would, say that, for the Westwood, it looks like we're paying $205,882 a year. Because that came up earlier. On the, whether or not we have it on Tuesday, I mean, I will cram as much as I can on going through all of these by Tuesday, but if we can have a little bit more time.
People that aren't on council.
For the Westwood, it looks like we're paying $205,882 a year. Because that came up earlier. On the, whether or not we have it on Tuesday, I will cram as much as I can on going through all of these by Tuesday, but if we can have a little bit more time. For the Westwood, it looks like we're paying $205,882 a year. Because that came up earlier. On the, whether or not we have it on Tuesday, I will cram as much as I can on going through all of these by Tuesday, but if we can have a little bit more time.
No, because I will respond to the questions.
I just got a notification that the audio seems to be disrupted. People at home are trying to hear now.
On the TV or on the?
Whatever the audio is, I think
So the one that kind of pains me the most, but I think would have the least negative impact, at least right now, would be the sustainability coordinator. Just because it is not a position that we've had and are trying to refill. I feel like a lot of the other positions are ones that we have had a warm body in at some point. I'm sure I can be corrected if that's not the case, but I feel like the sustainability coordinator is one of the few that has not previously been filled and had been vacated. I know it's just a drop in the bucket, but every drop counts. So that's one of the positions that I really like and work for. However, I think it's the one that would probably have the least negative impact because it's not one that has work that's already being done that is not being done. Because I feel like the sustainability coordinator is one of the few that has not previously been filled and had been vacated.
comments about the open position?
I know it's just a drop in the bucket. I do have
Councilmember
every drop counts. So that's one of the positions that I really like and work for. However, I think it's the one that would probably have the least negative impact. The animal welfare technician position has been open since September. Sorry, the animal welfare technician position has been open since September. Is that just one we've had trouble filling? Just
I should clarify police, not.
Oh, okay. I was like,
They down.
she was just here.
Can't get along
Did
with
she just walk out and quit?
well, I mean,
Took one for the team or something.
I guess they work in the basement, so it's not.
That shift work and they're down 4.
Yeah.
It's really a
Yeah.
critical situation.
There's one that's, I mean, since May.
Yes, they've been operating in overtime. Very,
Historically, it's
Well, I should
for a long
clarify.
time.
Remind me about that. Can't get along with
Did she just walk out and quit?
well, I mean, I guess they work in the basement, so it's not that shift work. Extensive reasons for why that happens. There's not enough people. I mean, it tends to happen a lot in the police department. They have to work 24/7, and if they don't have enough people, then other people have to fill in. No matter what, you just can't. I can't. We don't have enough. We're only gonna have 10 guys out today, so. But I do think we need to have, because this isn't the first time since I've been on council that the overtime issue has come up, and there's probably just not a lot of knowledge about how that happens. How do we get $1 million in overtime or
You
something?
have a new police chief and a newer fire chief, and that's a great conversation to have specifically.
What do we typically budget for I'll come to you. What do we typically budget for overtime?
Total or just,
For police overtime, for overtime in general, yes.
it'll take me a second, but I'll get an answer to that.
Thank you. And then in the meantime, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, and this kind of relates to that question. It doesn't take a whole lot of overtime hours for it to end up costing more than an employee. Do we have any idea in which departments or which positions that if we made a priority to try and fill them, maybe even increase the salary requirements a little bit, if we can keep it below what the overtime is costing,
It's
that would
police.
realize
It's
some savings?
The vast majority of overtime expenditures are in police.
Okay.
And our experience has been that even when police is fully staffed, the overtime expenditures stay level.
Councilmember Scanlon?
I know from a report that Chief King gave to the PSST Oversight Committee a week or so ago that he's deferred a fire academy because of the budget uncertainties that we've been talking about for the last however long. But that potentially manifests itself into overtime, because the longer you take to train a new group of firefighters, that means more and more vacancies that you have to fill on a shift basis. So his overtime bill goes up as a result. It's kind of false economy.
Following
I'd give you a chance to talk to it.
That's correct, Councilman Scanlon. Well, before we just hired this last academy, we were 16 personnel down. We are able and have the last several years, to my knowledge, always ended the fiscal year in the black on overtime, because we throw those salaries at overtime costs. The challenges we face during those circumstances, though, you start having an increase in on-the-job injuries. You are calling in people that aren't familiar with the district they're going to. It can affect response times. You'll see sick leave start mounting up. So it starts having a detrimental effect.
At precisely the wrong time because of your IPO audit.
ISO is coming up,
ISO,
so,
correct.
yeah, obviously response times, staffing, those are huge.
And then that manifests itself in insurance rates and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, when we start tinkering with staffing in those respects, it can have a negative impact for sure. But, yeah, to your point, I mean, I would rather not hire than have to fire or lay off, and we can manage where we are, but there is a point where we were at that point when we hired this last class.
But
And
there's
it's about a 10-month process from recruiting to on shift.
So following up on that, so the PSST pays specifically for the overtime of
Of the personnel budgeted in PSST.
and PSST. So, from what I recall, in the last fiscal year, the PSST was one of the mega trends because the general fund is going to have to absorb it due to the declining or volatility of sales tax. Correct?
Yes.
So ultimately, like, the general fund will absorb the overtime as well.
Yes.
Okay.
75 positions in the PSST.
70.
40 police.
Well, county
35.
fire is 90.
41 police officers and 32 firefighters.
So a lot
I
of,
remember.
so a lot of employees, yeah, a lot of our employees. So my question would be, on these positions, since they are budgeted, what is the rough number, I suppose, of what do these equal up to if we were to just, remove, which it pains me, believe me. I want
Okay,
nothing
now
more than
remembering
the-
that it doesn't really impact the budget, but it does impact the fund balance.
Okay.
To the extent you would have salary savings above the 800,000 of savings that you have already assumed, then yes, there would be a positive impact on the fund balance. And some of these are some, some fairly high dollar positions
Yeah.
and
I also-
some large numbers of positions, but I have not put numbers to them.
I also think that they're pretty critical positions, such as the victim advocate position, and that I believe is yet in the police department. I think that is a necessary position.
Can we get a grant for that?
That's a grant.
Is it a grant?
Yeah.
Perfect. So then, yeah. So then, this shouldn't have to go, but that's, my question is, is it worth, I mean, if we're taking a look at cuts and we're gonna have a discussion, so I think these need to be a part of that discussion, unfortunately. I want nothing more than to have more staff to help you guys, but,
And in that light, it is definitely a more comfortable scenario to slow roll this process than it would ever be to hand someone a pink slip. So,
Yeah.
we know today, as of today, we are working with these vacancies
yeah.
in our midst. So, for us to slow this process down is prudent at this point until at least we know what the timetable looks like for the resolution of our sales tax
The ordinance.
estimate, absolutely.
Okay, Councilmember Holman?
Just to clarify, the pending request is that we've budgeted for it, but staff, department heads haven't actually requested it
Haven't
yet?
initiated the recruitment yet.
Or we have
correct.
budgeted for it?
Yes.
Okay.
Any further discussion on the open positions? Seeing none, are there any miscellaneous comments at this time from council?
Chili dinner? Yeah, chili supper.
Chili dinner,
Norman
chili
High.
supper. Okay, then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all. Thank you.
So that's at Norman High is where that takes place?
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I was heading that way.
Right in the front cafeteria thing.
Oh, good deal.
And it's yummy.
Commons.
It is yummy.
It's pretty good.
They sell buckets of chili for $10.